The ties that bound the Old Dominion to her mother country were not just cultural, but economic. Lines of trade, ocean-crossing ships, and vast warehouses jammed with hogsheads of the precious tobacco in Britain and America alike. And no family understood those ligaments more thoroughly than the Lee brothers of Stratford Hall. Of the brothers, of the Virginians, really, no man was more intimately tied to this system than William Lee. While Richard Henry moved the Congress towards independence with his eloquence in Philadelphia, and Arthur engaged in clandestine operations in London and Paris, it was William Lee who straddled imperial finance, the tobacco trade, and revolutionary statecraft. Of all the sons of Thomas Lee, William sacrificed the most, giving up a massive fortune and high position for the cause of American independence. He holds a unique position for a founder, a dedicated Virginia patriot who successfully integrated himself into the highest echelons of the London establishment, becoming the first, and only, American citizen ever elected as an alderman of London. He retained this lifetime post of honor and authority within the heart of the empire even after the first blood had been shed at Lexington and Concord, operating as a first-hand witness to the calculations of the king's ministers, while systematically advising his countrymen across the sea that they must prepare for a total break from the crown. This chronicle follows the extraordinary and frustrating arc of William Lee's life. It tracks his early development from a disenfranchised younger son working as an unrewarded clerk at Stratford Hall to a successful merchant operating out of a London counting house on Tower Hill. It examines his plunge into the radical, anti-ministerial politics of the British metropolis, where he aligned himself with the popular movement for colonial rights. Charts his flight to continental Europe, where he served as a commercial agent in the vital port of Nantes, uncovering a deep nest of nepotism and fiscal irregularities that set him and his brother Arthur at permanent war with Benjamin Franklin and Silas Deane. And then we tell the tale of his rogue excursion into amateur militia diplomacy at Aix-la-Chapelle, where he drafted an unauthorized treaty with the representative of Amsterdam, a document that, through a remarkable sequence of maritime accidents, was intercepted by British cruisers and transformed into the casus belli that forced the Dutch Republic into a global war against Great Britain and helped win the Battle of Yorktown, though neither he nor the Dutch with whom he signed the treaty had authority to draft it. It's a story of calculation, sacrifice, and final blind isolation back home in Virginia. So, before we can understand William's diplomatic masterstroke, one that altered the course of the war, we need to look at how he was raised. William Lee was born within the thick brick walls of Stratford Hall in August 1739. As a younger son of Thomas Lee and Hannah Ludwell Lee, William did not enjoy the educational advantages allotted to his eldest brother, Philip Ludwell Lee, or the advanced amounts of capital and educational resources bestowed upon Richard Henry and the youngest and most brilliant son, Arthur Lee. While his older brothers and younger brother were sent home to England to receive an elite classical polishing at English schools like Eton, William and his middle brother, Francis Lightfoot, remained marooned on the Northern Neck estate. They received their entire education within the small brick schoolhouse in the Stratford yard, drilled in the fundamentals of the languages and historical texts by a Scottish tutor, the Reverend Mr. Craig. The death of Thomas Lee in late 1750, as we covered in our episode on the life of Thomas Lee, began a long period of unpleasantness for William. Under the mandates of their father's will, the eldest son, Philip Ludwell Lee, assumed control of the estate as its sole executor, and he withheld the monetary legacies of £1,000 sterling that had been left to the younger brothers under the will, and he cited as a pretext for this his father's debts to London merchant houses that needed to be paid back. We covered this in our episode on the Lee brothers, so I won't get into it in more depth here, but William Lee was not given the money that was due him. Holding the younger brothers in financial thrall, the overbearing Philip utilized his dependent William as a clerk, steward, and estate manager for Stratford Hall. For about 3 years, from 1755 to 58, William was forced to oversee the practical details of his brother's agrarian empire, managing the collection of tobacco rents from tenants at Philip's other estates, located in Westmoreland, Fairfax, Northumberland, and Loudoun counties in Virginia, as well as a tract of land in Maryland, monitoring the storage of crops within the inspection warehouses, and directing operations at the busy wharf of Stratford Landing. It was to be good training for his future career, if a humiliating life to live. While William resented Philip's arrogance and his refusal to pay him his rightful patrimony, this lengthy domestic submission period in his life served as a fantastic apprenticeship in the mechanics of the Atlantic economy, particularly the tobacco economy, as Stratford Hall was one of the most important centers of tobacco commerce in America and largely became such under Philip's watch. As Unger notes in his book, First Founding Father, quote, "On river's edge beneath Stratford Hall stood a mill, a warehouse, a landing for ocean-going transports, a ship's store, and a fully equipped shipyard to build, repair, and service ships. Scattered about the property was housing for as many as 100 slaves, servants, and workers, including weavers, carpenters, coopers, blacksmiths, shipwrights, millers, herdsmen, weavers, tailors, shoemakers, and other craftsmen." End quote. It was a thriving, self-sufficient, English waterfront-style community. In it, William learned the tobacco trade, and learned it well. He learned how tobacco was cultivated, cured, prized into hogsheads, and graded for the European market. He observed how British consignment merchants, called factors, manipulated freight charges, insurance premiums, and commission fees to keep much of the Virginia gentry locked in a state of near inescapable debt. He learned that much of the real wealth of the tobacco empire that had been constructed since John Rolfe brought the weed to America, as we covered in our episode on his life, did not belong to the planters who turned the soil and arranged for everything regarding tobacco, but to the merchant factors who simply managed the exchange at the ports in Great Britain and sold it. This was to prove a good lesson for the young man, as he was like his father Thomas, in that he had the driving spirit to build a great fortune. Describing this in the book Lee Chronicle, Casanova Gardner Lee says, quote, "William Lee had inherited the strong natural parts attributed to his father and had worked hard learning the tobacco trade in the warehouses and offices of Stratford. Prior to leaving Virginia, he had secured promises of consignments of tobacco from his relatives and friends, and now with confidence and diligence he started out once more, this time on his own keel. He represented these American tobacco planters on the Virginia Walk of the Royal Exchange, and as they became convinced of his ability and business acumen, he forged steadily ahead. But it makes us smile to see that this haughty Lee, when his instincts got him involved in politics, had to join a union in order to gain standing as an honest working man and worthy merchant. There being no tobacco guild, he became a member of the haberdashers, though the Skinners Guild would have done just as well. So William was a haberdasher on paper. He was probably the ablest Lee of his generation in a business sense, and was as highly successful in the tobacco trade as was Arthur Lee in the practice of law." End quote. That creation of his own tobacco counting house and immense success with it began in 1768, after William had spent many long years in Virginia working for his brother Philip and others. From 1763, after he returned back to Virginia from a 1761 trip to England to escort his sister Alice to her marriage to Dr. William Shippen, all the way through to 1768 when he left for England and then established his own counting house, William Lee both worked for Philip in a less apprentice-like, though still frustratingly underpaid role, and served as secretary for the Mississippi Company, a speculative venture trying to develop land out west. He also dabbled in politics, affixing his signature to the momentous Westmoreland Resolves in 1766. We covered the Lee family's involvement in that hugely important way of pushing back against the British government and Stamp Act in a past episode. In any case, by 1768, William, who had grown frustrated with Philip, tired of working for others, and desirous of doing something that would build his personal wealth, headed to England and soon became a leading tobacco merchant. Shortly after establishing his counting house, William secured his financial position for good through a brilliant marriage alliance. The Lees were known for these. In 1769, he wedded his first cousin, Hannah Philippa Ludwell. She was a primary heiress to the immense Ludwell fortune, and her inheritance brought William substantial cash capital and, even more importantly, title to the legendary but dilapidated Green Spring Plantation near Jamestown, an estate originally cleared and fortified by Governor Sir William Berkeley in the 17th century. Operating from a residence and counting house located at 33 Tower Hill, William launched his merchant house and slammed into immediate competition with the other old tobacco factors. You see, William's business model, and Hannah aided him in this quite a bit, was designed to operate as an extension of the Lee family power block and their friends in Virginia. He sold the tobacco crops produced by his brothers Richard Henry, Philip Ludwell, and Francis Lightfoot directly to English and continental buyers, eliminating the parasitic British middlemen who traditionally skimmed the profits of the members of the Tidewater gentry who had no brothers or sons to serve as merchants abroad. Now, these friends and family members didn't always send him as much of their tobacco as he wanted, as his angry letters about his brother Philip Ludwell betraying him yet again stands as a testament to. But the business prospered regardless, and his relations with the massive shipping facility Philip had turned Stratford into remained tolerable, if occasionally strained. He secured manufactured goods, cloth, legal volumes, agricultural tools, gifts for wives, directly from merchants in London and their warehouses, shipping them back to the Potomac at essentially cost. By straddling the Atlantic shipping lanes, William had transformed himself into an economic anchor of the Lee dynasty that helped it remain wealthy as other planters went broke, providing his brothers with the financial independence required to challenge the royal governor in Virginia, as we noted in our recent episode on his beloved brother Arthur. William Lee's counting house on Tower Hill stood within a city of London that was distinct from the court of King George III at Westminster. The city was, and remains, a highly autonomous municipal republic, governed by its own ancient charters, its own livery guilds, and its own elected assembly of aldermen. During the early 1770s, the generally Whiggish merchant class of the City of London was locked in a fierce and bitter political conflict with the King's ministry, recognizing that the government's coercive taxation policies in America were systematically destroying the credit networks and trade channels that sustained the wealth of the metropolis. William Lee, alongside his brother Arthur, plunged directly into this arena of radical municipal politics. They aligned themselves with John Wilkes, the firebrand Lord Mayor and leader of the anti-ministerial opposition, who had transformed the defense of American rights into a popular crusade for British liberty. Wilkes recognized the value of the Lee brothers, one that was unique. They were authentic Virginia gentlemen who possessed an intimate knowledge of the colonial grievances and unyielding commitment to the resistance. They're also both very bright, well-spoken, and sociable. Riding a great wave of pro-American and anti-ministerial sentiment among the small merchant and tradesmen of the city, William Lee achieved a spectacular ascent within the municipal government that paralleled his rise to fortune and fame as a tobacco merchant. In 1773, William was elected to serve as one of the two sheriffs of London, a high administrative post that placed him in charge of the execution of justice and the maintenance of order within the metropolis. Then, 2 years later, in May of 1775, precisely 1 month after the opening engagement of the Revolutionary War had been fought at Lexington and Concord, William achieved an even more extraordinary triumph. He was elected to the lifetime post of Alderman of London for the Aldgate ward, taking his seat within the highest governing council of the empire's capital. William Lee could take his position in the London government as a proud Virginia patriot with no shame. He had been elected despite the Tory government, not to make peace with it. He had been elected, essentially, to be an American patriot in London. In his official capacity as alderman, William did not hesitate to carry the colonial resistance straight to the feet of the king. Clad in his formal municipal robes, he accompanied the Lord Mayor and the Common Council to the throne at St. James's Palace, presenting a series of blunt, fiercely critical petitions that explicitly protested the ministry's military actions in America and demanded the immediate dismissal of the cabinet. This didn't happen, but imagine the scene. A native-born Virginian utilizing the ancient corporate privileges of the City of London to openly define the sovereign ruler of the British Empire within his own palace walls. Must have been quite the moment. While William was enjoying this spectacular elevation to the heights of municipal power and glory, driving the streets in a coach and four in his municipal robes, a powerful and successful business at his back, his commercial letters to Virginia reveal a completely sober, unclouded understanding of the budding imperial crisis, driving his beloved home state to war. He recognized that the ministry of Lord North was committed to a policy of military subjugation of the colonies, and that the English merchant class, despite its loud protests of what the ministry was up to, would ultimately submerge its principles to protect its investments if the war were prolonged. William warned his brother Richard Henry not to rely on petitions to the throne or even the hypothetical benevolence of British Whigs. Though some were favorable to the American cause, as shown by his election, the Americans would have to fight alone. In a blunt dispatch written in late 1774, he stated clearly that the colonies must, quote, depend upon your own exertions and act like men, end quote, preparing their militias for an unyielding struggle against the British Empire. In these letters, William also argued against slavery, though his warnings and calls to action in these were less heeded by the planters of his home state. By the early months of 1777, the progress of the war made William's dual identity as a London alderman and a Virginia patriot untenable. The British ministry implemented strict treason acts, and his counting house on Tower Hill was placed under constant surveillance by government agents. There was no longer any good he could do in London, and William knew what he had to do, and so did it. In one swift move, William sacrificed his thriving London business, abandoned his alderman's robes, and fled across the English Channel to continental Europe. The Continental Congress back in America had formally appointed him to serve alongside Thomas Morris as a joint commercial agent for the United States in the critical French port of Nantes. He, as John Adams put it, quote, abandoned an advantageous establishment in England from attachment to his country and was able and faithful in her service, end quote. Nantes was the true operational center of the hidden American war materiel effort in France. It was a bustling haven where American privateers brought their captured British prizes and where covert French ordnance, muskets, blankets, gunpowder, procured through the shadow firm of Rodriguez Hortelez and Company, the firm we discussed in our episode on Arthur Lee, was loaded onto transport ships for General Washington's army, helping win it various battles around the Northern Campaign in particular, such as when the American forces who weren't serving under Washington won at Saratoga. The post of commercial agent was a position of immense financial responsibility, requiring the management of public sales, the auditing of prize commissions, and the protection of the new nation's very fragile credit. Upon his arrival in the port, William was horrified to discover the same sort of thing his brother Arthur had discovered, a vast, unchecked web of decay and corruption. His colleague, Thomas Morris, was a hopeless alcoholic who had more or less completely abandoned his public duties, leaving the official records of the agency to rot while he spent his days in a state of permanent intoxication. But the real problem was Thomas's very powerful half-brother, Robert Morris, the superintendent of finance in Philadelphia, who structured the agency as a private family syndicate to enrich them. William discovered that Silas Deane, the corrupt member of the legation, as we discussed in our episode on Arthur Lee, operating from the central legation outside Paris, had teamed up with Benjamin Franklin's young nephew, Jonathan Williams, to establish a monopoly over the American business in Nantes. Williams had been appointed as the prize agent for the port, and he and Deane were intermingling public congressional funds with their private merchant accounts to reap fortunes. They were charging the cash-starved Continental Congress exorbitant commissions on public transactions, using government vessels to transport private commercial cargoes, and allocating lucrative contracts to their personal friends while refusing to present any ledger books to William, the successful merchant, for accounting. Like his younger brother Arthur, William possessed an honest and uncompromising nature. He refused to sign off on Jonathan Williams's unverified accounts or to sanction Deane's private commercial speculations. William launched a barrage of detailed, evidence-backed dispatches to Congress, blowing the whistle on the faction at Passy, and explicitly accusing Deane and Williams of public embezzlement involving their activities in Nantes. By doing his duty, William earned the fierce and unyielding hatred of the most powerful men in the revolutionary government. Silas Deane, who had many powerful friends back in Philadelphia, viewed him as a dangerous obstructionist who was ruining the efficiency of the supply lines, while Benjamin Franklin grew intensely irritated by William's constant demands for accountability and getting rid of corruption. Robert Morris was furious that Lee was interfering with his family's highly lucrative commercial arrangements, and so used his leverage in Congress to undermine William's authority. To remove this troublesome whistleblower from the ports of France, the commissioners and their allies inside Congress executed a very classic bureaucratic maneuver. They resolved to kick William Lee upstairs. They secured him an appointment from Congress to serve as the diplomatic envoy to the distant courts of Berlin and Vienna, sending him far away from Nantes and the corruption within it into what they thought would be a diplomatic wilderness. So they thought. At first, that went as expected. William Lee's diplomatic missions to Prussia and Austria were doomed from the moment he left France. As Arthur found as well, Frederick, even if he hated the British for how they'd abandoned him during the 7 Years' War, was uninterested in any alliance with the Americans, and the Austrians were as well. And so William traveled across the German states under a cloud of very intense frustration, arriving in Vienna only to find the gates of the imperial palace closed entirely to his entreaties. Both the court of the Holy Roman Emperor and the administration of Frederick the Great in Berlin were locked in the opening maneuvers of the War of the Bavarian Succession, and they recognized that any formal recognition of an American rebel envoy would immediately alienate the British ministry and potentially pose problems for them in this upcoming war. William found himself stranded in Germany, entirely unreceived, denied any official audience, and forbidden from presenting his credentials even to the ministries. So, marooned in what could have been a just pointless situation with no official business to conduct, William decided to use his training as an independent merchant and try and make something happen on his own. He refused to just sit quietly in an expensive exile and let his country fight for survival on its own. And he particularly recognized that America was facing potential financial starvation and required a secondary source of credit outside of France if it was going to win the war and thrive as a new nation after the war. So he decided to use his training as a merchant and a man who understood international finance to initiate a very rogue diplomatic maneuver. In the summer of 1778, acting with total independence and without a shred of official authorization from either the Continental Congress or even the central legation outside Paris, William journeyed to the spa town of Aix-la-Chapelle. Through a network of clandestine mercantile connections, he organized a series of backroom conferences with Jean de Neufville, a prominent, wealthy merchant who was operating as a similarly unauthorized, surreptitious representative for the anti-British burgomasters of Amsterdam. Amsterdam was the financial heart of the Dutch Republic, and its leadership was quite eager to break the British maritime monopoly and open up a direct, lucrative trade with the American continent, though the princes of Orange were not fans of that, and so there was conflict within the Dutch Republic over what to do regarding America and Britain. Lee and Neufville sat at a wooden table and designed a blueprint of sorts for future alliance. Using his extensive knowledge of commercial law, William drafted a 36-article treaty of amity and commerce between the United States of America and the Republic of the United Netherlands. The document was structured to define the terms of reciprocal trade, establish the boundaries of neutral shipping rights, map out a way of eliminating tiresome and painful British customs barriers. The problem was that William had no authority to draft this treaty, nor did Neufville. It was rogue diplomacy executed by an unreceived exile operating entirely on his own authority. But it was signed by the two men, put together by them nevertheless, and when William returned to Paris with it and proudly presented the secret Dutch treaty to the commissioners, their reaction was predictably cold and dismissive. Benjamin Franklin was thoroughly annoyed by William's meddling and his defiance of official protocols, and he looked upon the document as being both amateur and irrelevant because it was unauthorized. He refused to forward the text to the French ministry or do anything to ratify it, and instead chose to pack the treaty away in a dark drawer in his office where it lay forgotten, essentially, for 2 years. But it didn't end there. William's rogue treaty was destined to turn into a massive international crisis in the autumn of 1780. The American diplomat, Henry Lawrence, was crossing the Atlantic aboard a packet ship, and he carried with him a collection of unclassified public papers to his new post in Europe. But hidden within Lawrence's personal baggage was a duplicate copy of the unauthorized Lee-Neufville Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. When a British royal cruiser intercepted the American vessel, Lawrence didn't have time to throw his papers into the sea, and British boarding officers seized his trunk. In it, they discovered this secret treaty with the Dutch. Now, it had been unauthorized. The Dutch hadn't actually consented to it as a state, but the British didn't care. It created an international crisis, and the British ministry, which was already furious with Dutch merchants for smuggling naval supplies to the French and American fleets, decided to use it as a weapon. They presented it to the States General of the Netherlands and demanded the immediate arrest and execution of the Amsterdam burgomasters who had dared to negotiate with an American rebel. The Dutch government refused to comply, noting that it was sovereign, and so Great Britain used the rogue treaty as a casus belli. In December of 1780, Parliament formally declared war against the United Netherlands, launching the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War. In the end, this was a huge strategic victory for the United States, if not for the Dutch. By forcing Holland into the conflict, William Lee's amateur militia diplomacy had shattered Britain's ability to blockade America, really. The British Royal Navy had to divert dozens of its warships away from the American coastline to defend the North Sea trade lanes and blockade Dutch ports. Now, the British Navy was still of strength in the Americas, but this was a serious diversion of force, and it significantly weakened the British control over their Atlantic shipping lanes and their ability to determine things along the Atlantic coast, opening up the very maritime opportunity that allowed the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse to cut off Lord Cornwallis's escape at Yorktown. William Lee's rogue militia diplomacy years before at Aix-la-Chapelle had inadvertently led to the crushing of Cornwallis at Yorktown. Yet, when the long and exhausting war finally ground to its conclusion, 1783, the new American Republic demonstrated little gratitude to this merchant who had sacrificed his fortune for its birth. The Continental Congress remained dominated by his old mercantile adversaries, and so William Lee was quietly recalled from his European posts, essentially demobilized from the diplomatic service, and wasn't given a single vote of thanks, much less any financial compensation for the destruction of the London business he gave up to serve his country. He found himself politically isolated, financially depleted, though far from poverty, and unrewarded and unrecognized by the country he had sacrificed his thriving business, successful political career in London, and years of his life to create. As Casanova Gardner Lee puts it, he, quote, must have nostalgically looked back to the splendid occasions when he rode the streets of London in his coach and four as alderman of the city and with the Lord Mayor stood before the king in behalf of the colonies. Those were the halcyon days. Recollections of the later war years must have brought mixed emotions, but even had he been able to foresee the outcome, his decision would have had to be the same, for he had taken the only possible course, end quote. The Lee family was always willing to do its duty, whatever the cost. In late 1783, profoundly disillusioned man, William returned to the soil of Virginia after many years to collect roughly 10,000 pounds sterling in debts owed him by various Virginians, a gargantuan sum, and to restart operations at the Green Spring estate he and Hannah had inherited so that they could live there after the war and just be Virginia planters. His beloved wife, Hannah Ludwell Lee, was sick and was supposed to soon sail back and join him. But then he got word. She passed away from illness in Brussels before she could even set sail across the Atlantic, dying in the old world she had made her home. William was alone. He traveled down the river roads to assume personal management of his late wife's estate at Green Spring. He found the historic plantation in a state of just utter dilapidation, years of wartime neglect, British military raids along the James River, poor oversight of it, in which he had been involved in dealing with an overseer, that those negotiations went poorly. All of that had combined to shatter the agrarian infrastructure of this formerly great estate. The fields were choked with weeds, the drainage ditches had collapsed, the livestock had been mostly plundered, the great manor house even was unstable and really unfit for life. So he had to get all that back in order. And as he did so, he suffered a really dark sequence of severe physical decline. He suffered from a severe, agonizing form of inflammatory arthritis that crippled his joints very frequently, preventing him from even walking his fields or riding his boundary lines, as planters love doing. Similarly, a progressive disease began to destroy his optic nerves, and slowly and inexorably, the master of Green Spring watched the light fade from his world. He desperately tried to arrest the decay by traveling to New York and undergoing a painful primitive cataract surgery, but the operation failed and he was left eventually in a state of total blindness. He spent these remaining years of his life trapped in an internal darkness, dependent on the voices of his children and the letters read aloud by his attendants. On June 27th, 1795, William Lee died at the relatively young age of 55. His mortal remains were carried down the peninsula and deposited within an unassuming grave in the old, overgrown churchyard at Jamestown, within sight of the crumbling brick tower where the first English settlers had planted their colony. But the moral and ideological trajectory of his life did not expire in the Jamestown dirt. In his last will, William left the entire consolidated and somewhat renewed Green Spring estate to a surviving son, William Ludwell Lee, but William survived him by a mere 10 years. Anti-slavery in attitude like his father, upon his own premature death in 1803, William Ludwell Lee emancipated every single slave living upon the Green Spring plantation, and more than that, he allocated substantial portions of the estate's capital to construct houses for the freed families, provide them with agricultural tools and livestock, and even establish a dedicated trust fund to maintain and educate their children for generations to come. But then the William Lee line faded from history, really, after this point. So the story of William Lee is a sad one, but a powerful one as well. It's the story of a man who used his flaming spirit, his great skill, to build a massive fortune and help start a new nation. He was an aristocrat who worked the counting house desks, a sheriff who challenged the king in front of his throne, and a whistleblower who risked his name to expose corruption. His rogue pen at Aix-la-Chapelle helped win the revolution at Yorktown, and he showed how much the men who made our republic sacrificed and suffered to create it. So thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode, got something out of it. I found his life quite interesting to study. If you're listening to this still, please make sure to like and subscribe on whatever platform you're listening on. If you leave a comment, that really helps boost it so other people see it. And if you know anyone who might be interested, I'd of course appreciate you sharing it around. Thank you again for listening, and I'll see you again next time. Bye.